In the shadowed hollows of the Ozark Mountains, where the ancient pines whispered secrets older than the hills themselves, the year 1894 hung heavy with an unspoken dread. The air was thick, not just with the damp mist that clung to the underbrush like a shroud, but with something far more insidious, a palpable sense of things unseen, entities that slumbered beneath the earth's crust, waiting for the right incantation to stir them from their abyssal repose. It was here, in a forgotten hamlet named Whispering Hollow, that Elias Thorne, a itinerant scholar of antiquities, found himself drawn by an inexplicable compulsion. He had come chasing fragments of lore, pieced together from yellowed manuscripts in distant libraries, tales of women who dwelt in isolation, guardians of rites that blurred the line between the carnal and the cosmic. The locals spoke in furtive glances, their voices dropping to murmurs when he inquired about the disappearances, strong men, loggers and drifters, vanishing into the night as if swallowed by the very ground. Best not meddle, an old crone had warned him at the inn, her eyes like pits reflecting some inner void. Them witches collect what ain't theirs, and what they do in them beds, it ain't for mortal eyes. But Elias, driven by that fatal curiosity which has doomed so many before him, pressed on, his lantern cutting feeble swaths through the encroaching dark. As the moon ascended, bloated and indifferent, he followed a winding path deeper into the woods, unaware that the trees themselves seemed to lean in, as if to listen, or perhaps to ensnare. A faint glow emerged ahead, from a cabin that should not have been there, its timbers twisted in unnatural angles that defied Euclidean sanity. And from within, a soft chant rose, rhythmic and seductive, promising revelations that would unravel the fragile threads of his mind. The autumn of 1894 had already bled most of its color from the world when Elias Thorne guided his weary mare down the last wagon trace into the high Ozarks. A cold rain had chased him for 3 days across the Missouri lowlands, turning every rut into a sucking mire and every creek into a brown, angry serpent. His oilskin coat hung heavy with water, his boots were ruined, and the scholarly hunger that had driven him out of St. Louis, the promise of a lost grimoire said to predate the Salem Panic, now felt like a child's fancy against the raw indifference of the hills. He had expected isolation, but not this kind. The mountains rose in sudden, brutal folds, their limestone bones jutting through thin soil like the ribs of some colossal, half-buried thing. Scrub pine and blackjack oak crowded the ridges so tightly that the sky appeared only in ragged wounds overhead. No birds called. Even the wind seemed to move with reluctance, as though it feared what it might disturb. Every few miles he passed abandoned clearings where chimneys stood alone among weeds, their hearths long cold, their inhabitants gone without record or grave marker. By dusk on the 4th day he reached a narrow valley locals on the flats had refused to name. They had only crossed themselves and muttered about the hollow before turning away. Smoke, thin and grey, rose from a single cluster of cabins clinging to the creek like barnacles. The settlement had no proper name on any map Elias owned. The oldest inhabitant, a woman with eyes the color of spoiled milk, called it Whispering Hollow and nothing more. When he asked for lodging, doors shut without a word. Only the tavern, really just a dog-trot house with a barrel of corn liquor on the porch, offered shelter in exchange for coin and silence. Inside, the air was thick with tallow smoke and the sour reek of bodies too long unwashed. Men sat hunched over tin cups, their faces carved deep by weather and something less natural. Conversation died the moment Elias crossed the threshold. He felt their stares settle on him the way damp leaves cling to boots. When he spoke of folklore, of old rites worked by women who lived deeper in the hills, a stillness fell so complete he could hear the rain dripping through the chink roof. Then, one by one, they looked into the fire and said nothing at all. The silence itself became a warning, ancient and patient, the kind that has watched men disappear for generations and never once bothered to explain why. That night the tavern emptied early, the men slipping out like smoke through cracks, leaving Elias alone with the dying fire and the tavern keeper's wife, a gaunt woman who moved as though her joints had been replaced with rusted wire. She refilled his cup without being asked, her fingers brushing his with the chill of creek stones. When he tried again to speak of the missing, she only pressed a cracked fingernail to her lips and glanced toward the loft where her husband pretended to sleep. Later, unable to rest on the cornshuck pallet, Elias stepped onto the porch. The rain had stopped, the air hung so still that every drip from the eaves sounded like a footstep. Across the muddy trace, Lamplight flickered in the window of the settlement's only other open building, an ancient log church whose door stood ajar. Inside, 3 old men sat on the puncheon benches, heads bowed, passing a jug in slow ritual. They did not pray. They only drank and listened, as though waiting for something to speak first. He crossed the yard, boots sinking ankle deep. The nearest elder, face creased like old leather, finally met his eyes. "You smell of cities, mister. Cities don't matter here." His voice was the rasp of dead leaves over gravel. "Men come through every few years. Strong backs, quick tongues. They ask the same questions you're fixing to ask." Elias crouched, keeping his tone low. "I've heard talk of women living alone up the ridges. Women who take what they need and leave no trail." A second elder spat into the cold hearth. "Take is too gentle a word." He drew a trembling finger across his own throat, then lower, a slow deliberate line down the sternum that ended just below the belt. "They collect. Like a body collects scars. Like a tree collects rings." The third, youngest of the 3 yet still stooped with decades, leaned forward until Elias could smell the corn mash on his breath. "My brother went up there in 79. Found his hat 2 springs later, brim full of teeth that weren't his. Teeth still wet. He let the silence settle, heavy as wet wool. Whatever they do in them beds ain't birthing babies and it ain't pleasure. It's measuring. Weighing something only they can see. And when they're done, what comes back down the mountain ain't always wearing the same skin it left in." Behind them, the single candle guttered, throwing their shadows long and jagged across the hewn log walls, shadows that seemed to twitch a heartbeat longer than the men themselves moved. Dawn came thin and grey, the color of a blade left too long in ashes. Elias saddled his mare with numb fingers and rode out before the settlement stirred, following a deer trace that climbed straight into the teeth of the ridge. The higher he went, the more the world narrowed, sky pressed low by cedar boughs, the creek reduced to a black thread far below, every hooffall muffled by decades of shed needles. He told himself he was only mapping the terrain, cataloguing possible locations for the rumored grimoire, but the lie tasted thin even in his own mouth. Near noon the path leveled onto a shelf of rock where wild azalea grew in blood-red clumps. There, half hidden beneath hanging vines, stood a woman. She was taller than most men of the hollow, dressed in homespun the color of storm clouds, a shawl of black fox thrown loose over her shoulders. Her hair, unbound and the red-black of wet garnets, moved though no wind touched it. She was splitting kindling with a hatchet no larger than a kitchen knife, yet each stroke rang like a church bell against the stone. When she looked up, her eyes caught the weak light and held it, green shot through with something molten. "You're a long way from any road worth the name," she said. The accent was Ozark yet strangely clean, as though she had learned English from books rather than mouths. "Horse looks ready to drop, and so do you." Elias dismounted before he decided to, the reins slipping through his fingers like water. Up close her skin was pale, almost translucent at the temples, faint blue rivers visible beneath. She smelled of wood smoke, crushed yarrow, and something sweeter that made his pulse misstep. "I seek shelter," he heard himself say. "One night. I can pay." A smile touched her mouth but did not reach the eyes. "Pay is never coin up here." She drove the hatchet into the chopping log and left it quivering. "My cabin's another mile. Fire's lit, stew's on. You can stable the mare in the lean-to." She turned without waiting for refusal, moving up the trace with the sureness of someone born to the slope. He followed because the path behind him now looked darker than it had an hour earlier, because the azalea blossoms seemed to lean after her the way iron filings follow a lodestone, because some part of him had already stepped off the edge of ordinary caution and was falling, pleasantly and without alarm, into whatever waited ahead. The hatchet handle still rocked gently in the log, keeping time with his heart. The cabin crouched against the mountainside like something that had grown there rather than been built, its logs blackened by centuries of smoke and rain, roofed with hand-riven shakes gone silver-gray. No chimney breathed. Instead, a thin haze leaked from between the chinks and hung above the eaves in a motionless veil. A single window of real glass, an extravagance that should not exist this far up, glowed amber from within, the light steady, almost oily. She pushed the door with 2 fingers and it swung inward without a sound. Heat rolled out, thick with the scent of cedar, dried bloodroot, and something coppery that prickled the back of Elias's throat. The room was larger than the exterior allowed, stretching back into shadow that refused the lamplight. Every inch of wall was lined with shelves, jars of murky fluid in which pale things floated, bundles of herbs tied with red thread, books bound in cracked leather and stranger materials that caught the glow wrong. In the center stood a table of dark walnut, its surface scarred by generations of knives. On it rested an open volume the size of a family Bible, pages thick as parchment, ink still glistening though the hand that wrote it must have withered long ago. Elias saw diagrams of the human form overlaid with constellations, veins mapped to ley lines, the womb and phallus drawn as intersecting gates. Marginalia crawled in languages that hurt to follow with the eye. Above the hearth hung a quilt of extraordinary craftsmanship, squares of midnight cloth appliqued with silver thread that formed sigils he almost recognized. When the fire flared, the symbols seemed to writhe, rearranging themselves into new and more disturbing patterns. A low bed, wide enough for three, occupied the far corner, draped in bearskins and something softer, paler, that might once have been deer hide but now carried faint, unmistakable whirls of human fingerprints pressed into the curing. She moved about the room with calm ownership, lifting a kettle from the crane, pouring dark liquid into tin cups. Her shadow on the wall was wrong, too tall, joints bending in directions no spine should allow, fingers elongating into tapers that scraped the rafters though her real hands never rose above the table. When she turned, the shadow snapped back into ordinary proportions, as though it had never misbehaved. "Sit," she said, and the word settled on his shoulders like a hand. "The mountain takes its toll on strangers. Drink this. It steadies the blood." He obeyed, drawn forward by the smell rising from the cup, honey, iron, and a green note sharp as broken pine needles. The first sip coated his tongue with warmth that spread outward in slow, deliberate rings, loosening the knots in his chest, quieting the small sane voice that had begun whispering of departure. Across the table her gaze never left his face, patient and appraising, the way a butcher studies livestock that has not yet realized it is already sold. The warmth from the cup did not fade, it deepened, thickened, turned viscous in his veins until every heartbeat felt like pushing molasses through cracked clay. Elias tried to set the tin cup down and discovered his fingers would not answer. They rested against the wood as though grown there, skin fused to walnut grain. A lazy curiosity drifted across his mind, why could he not lift his hand, but it carried no alarm, only the mild interest one feels watching clouds rearrange themselves into unfamiliar animals. Across the table her face softened into something almost tender. She reached out, slow enough that he saw each inch of distance close, and brushed a lock of hair from his forehead with the back of one cool knuckle. Where she touched, the skin tingled, then numbed, as though frost had bloomed beneath the surface. "Easy," she murmured, voice pitched low, the way a mother hushes a child sliding into fever dreams. "The root needs time to walk the rivers." The room tilted. Not the sudden lurch of drunkenness, but a gradual, inevitable tipping, as though the entire cabin had become a ship easing away from dock. The lamplight smeared sideways, stretching shadows into taffy. He watched, detached, as she rose and moved behind him, felt the faint tug of laces being loosened, the weight of his coat sliding from shoulders that no longer quite belonged to him. Boots came off next, she lifted each foot with the care of someone undressing a sleeping infant, then the wool shirt, the linen beneath, until the air itself kissed skin that had forgotten how to shiver. She guided him, not roughly, never roughly, down a short corridor that had not existed moments earlier. The walls here were unpeeled logs, dark and damp, exhaling the smell of deep earth. Iron rings had been driven between the timbers at intervals, from some hung short lengths of chain gone soft with rust and other stains. At the passage's end a low doorway opened into a chamber lit by a single tallow candle set in a human scapula. The bed that waited was not the one he had glimpsed earlier. This one was broader, built of thick oak planks bolted to the floor, its mattress a deep cradle of feathers and something denser that gave slightly underweight like living muscle. Leather cuffs, buttersoft and dark with use, lay open at each corner. Above, the ceiling beams were carved with grooves that met in a perfect spiral directly over the pillow. She eased him down. The feathers sighed as they took his weight, then closed around him like a mouth. Somewhere far away his mind noted the restraints closing, wrist, wrist, ankle, ankle, the quiet snick of buckles no louder than a beetle walking across paper. The candle flame bowed, though no draught moved. In its trembling light her face hovered, beautiful and pitiless, green eyes reflecting depths that had never known sun. "Sleep now," she whispered, lips brushing the shell of his ear. The measuring begins gently. Consciousness returned in slow, reluctant pulses, like surf dragging over broken shells. Elias tasted iron and yarrow on a tongue that felt too thick for his mouth. The candle had burned lower, its flame a sullen red tongue licking the scapula's hollow. He lay naked on the oak bed, wrists and ankles still cuffed, but the leather had been lined overnight with something soft, rabbit fur, perhaps, so that no chafing marked his skin. The gentleness of that detail chilled him more than pain ever could. Voices drifted in from the outer room, women's voices, layered and overlapping like wind through different heights of cedar. He counted 5, maybe 6. They spoke softly, yet every syllable landed inside his skull with the weight of hammered nails. A door he had not seen before opened without a creak, and they entered single file, barefoot, dressed in simple shifts the color of fresh bruises. Their ages were impossible to fix. One might have been 20, the next 200, the next both at once. Hair ranged from moonpale to crowing black, all unbound, all moving though the air remained perfectly still. The woman who had lured him, the one with garnet hair, stood foremost. She carried no knife, no wand, only a small clay bowl filled with something that steamed though the room was cold. Behind her the others arranged themselves in a loose semicircle, hands resting lightly on one another's shoulders, forming a living chain. "You are awake," the garnet-haired woman said. "Not a question. Good. The root loosens the hinges, but it cannot open the door. Only you can do that." She knelt beside the bed and dipped 2 fingers into the bowl. The substance that coated them was thick, dark, shot through with tiny flecks that caught the candlelight like mica. When she drew a line down his sternum, the touch burned cold. "We do not steal," she continued, voice calm as deep water. "We borrow. A season, a year, sometimes longer. The vessel must be willing at the marrow, or the gate stays shut." Her fingers traced lower, pausing just above the navel. "Long ago we learned that terror seals a man tighter than any chain. So we offer pleasure first, then truth. Most choose to stay once they understand." Another woman stepped forward, younger in appearance, eyes the pale gray of winter sky. She placed her palm over Elias's heart. Beneath it he felt the organ stutter, then match a rhythm not his own. "The stars are leaning close this cycle," she said. "Something older than names hungers to wear flesh again. We prepare the bed, we prepare the key. You, Elias Thorne, carry the older blood. Did you never wonder why the manuscripts called to you across half a continent?" The circle tightened. Hands reached out, not to harm, but to rest, on brow, throat, belly, thighs, until he was covered in cool female palms that pulsed in perfect unison. From somewhere deeper in the mountain came an answering throb, slow as continental drift, vast as buried oceans. The carved spiral overhead began to turn though nothing moved it, and the candle flame stretched tall, thinning into a needle of black fire that pointed straight into his opened eyes. The circle parted just enough to let him see the far wall. A heavy curtain of stitched hides hung there, the seams worked with sinew and hair that might have been human. The garnet-haired woman drew it aside with one slow pull. Behind lay a shallow alcove no longer than a coffin, its floor a slab of black stone veined with dull red. Upon the stone rested what had once been a man. He was alive, in the loosest sense. Skin clung to bone like wet paper over a cage of sticks. The ribs rose and fell in shallow, arrhythmic tides, each breath a separate agony. Where eyes should have been, only soft craters remained, healed over with translucent scar tissue that fluttered when he turned his head toward the newcomers. His mouth, lipless, gums shrunken to purple cords, worked soundlessly, shaping words no tongue could form. Between his spread thighs the flesh had been opened in a perfect vertical incision, folded back and pinned with iron needles the length of knitting skewers. The wound did not bleed, instead it breathed, slow and tidal, exhaling a faint shimmer of heat that carried the stench of deep caves and menstrual blood. The women paid him the attention one gives a familiar tool. One stroked the ruined cheek as she might calm a horse. Another adjusted a needle with maternal care. The The creature on the slab arched weakly at the touch, a motion that sent ripples across the exposed interior. Layers of muscle and fat peeled away in deliberate petals, revealing organs that glowed faintly, as though lit from within by dying embers. The heart, larger than it should have been, beat inside a cradle of exposed ribs, each pulse pushing a thin thread of silver light along arteries that no longer followed human paths. "This was Caleb," the garnet-haired woman said conversationally. "A drummer boy from the war, strong as winter wheat. He stayed with us 7 years. Long enough for the first guest to settle." She rested her hand on the thing's sternum. The heart beneath leapt like a hooked fish. "See how beautifully he carries it now. The shell thins, the voice grows clearer. Soon the skin will split along the old seams and what wears him will step out whole." A low sound finally escaped the lipless mouth, not pain, not quite. It was recognition, or welcome. The blind head lifted, seeking Elias across the chamber, and for one impossible instant Elias felt the weight of something ancient and ravenous looking out through those empty sockets, measuring the fit of his bones, the capacity of his marrow, tasting the flavor of his terror like wine on a connoisseur's tongue. The candle flame bowed toward the alcove as though pulled by the same hunger. The carved spiral overhead spun faster, grinding softly against the beam, and the mountain itself answered with a subterranean groan that vibrated up through the oak bed and into Elias's spine. The rhythm of their chant grew heavier, almost drowsy, the women swaying in slow unison like reeds under deep water. Hands still rested on his skin, but the pressure had eased into something absent-minded, the way a seamstress might keep pins between her lips while turning the cloth. The candle in the scapula guttered once, twice, then steadied, throwing a sudden flare that lit the chamber in corpse white. That flare was all the warning Elias needed. In its brief glare he saw the nearest woman's eyes half-closed, lips parted, lost in the cadence. The garnet-haired leader had turned toward the alcove, one palm pressed to Caleb's ruined chest as if listening for a heartbeat that belonged to something else entirely. The circle's grip had loosened by a single, careless inch. Pain exploded back into his limbs like molten lead poured into frozen pipes. He welcomed it. Pain meant the root was thinning, that his blood was his own again. He rolled his shoulders experimentally. The leather cuffs, butter-soft and ancient, gave a fraction under the sudden strain. Another breath, deeper, tasting iron and smoke. Then he wrenched his right wrist downward with everything the mountain had left in him. The cuff, slick with generations of sweat and stranger fluids, slid over the heel of his hand with a wet pop. Agony flared bright and clean. One hand free. The chant faltered, only a skipped heartbeat, but enough. He twisted, teeth sinking into the meat of his own forearm to muffle the scream, and tore the second cuff loose the same way, skin parting like wet paper. He was moving before thought caught up. A rolling lunge off the bed, shoulder slamming into the knees of the nearest woman. She folded with a startled exhale that sounded almost human. Bare feet hit cold stone, chains still dragged from his ankles but the hasps hung open, forgotten in ritual complacency. He snatched the scapular candle as he passed, flame whipping sideways, and hurled it into the alcove where it shattered against Caleb's chest. Tallow and fire bloomed across peeled flesh. The thing on the slab convulsed once and let out a sound no human throat had ever owned. The women spun, faces sharpening from dream to fury. The garnet-haired leader's mouth opened in a snarl that showed too many teeth. Elias was already at the low doorway, diving through it headfirst, shoulder scraping sparks from the log wall. Behind him the mountain itself seemed to inhale, a vast indrawn breath that sucked the air from his lungs and dimmed every lamp at once. He ran blind down the impossible corridor, chains clinking like funeral bells, the taste of his own blood metallic and sweet on his tongue. The cabin door stood ajar. Someone had left it that way, careless or certain no guest would ever choose to leave. Beyond it the night waited, black and starless, the trees leaning close as conspirators. The night outside was not the same night he had entered. The sky had been pulled down like a quilt, thick and airless, the moon nowhere, only a bruised seam where it should have been. Pines stood in perfect silence, needles motionless though something vast moved between them. Elias ran barefoot over stone that felt warm, almost fevered, the chains at his ankles dragging ribbons of skin with every stride. Blood painted his wake, black in the starless dark, and the ground drank it greedily. Behind him the cabin exhaled a single word, his name, stretched into a cord that made the treetops shiver. Then the women came. Not running, gliding, shifts fluttering though no wind stirred, feet barely brushing the duff. Their eyes caught what little light remained and threw it back as green foxfire. Distance meant nothing to them. One moment they were shapes at the edge of hearing, the next they flowed around him like smoke, never quite touching, herding him the way wolves guide a stumbling deer toward the chosen kill ground. He veered downhill, lungs burning, and the slope betrayed him, flattening into a shelf of bare rock he had not seen on the ascent. At its center rose a ring of standing stones older than any Indian trace, waist-high slabs of quartz-shot granite arranged in a perfect circle. Between them the ground dipped into a shallow bowl no wider than a parlor floor, its surface polished smooth by centuries of rain, or something heavier. Runes had been carved deep into the rim, filled long ago with a dark resin that still glistened wet. Elias skidded to a halt at the edge, momentum nearly pitching him in. The bowl was not empty. At its lowest point lay a second bed, this one carved from a single block of obsidian, black glass veined with silver that moved when stared at too long. Restraints of braided copper wire glinted at each corner, warm to the eye, as though recently used. Above it the air itself had thickened into a lens, through it the missing moon appeared, swollen and red, hanging impossibly close, its face scarred with the same spiral he had seen in the cabin ceiling. The women closed the ring, silent now, patient. The garnet-haired leader stepped forward and placed one bare foot on the rim. Where her soul touched, the resin runes flared crimson, and the mountain answered with a pulse that knocked Elias to his knees. The obsidian bed drank the moonlight and gave back a low, hungry thrum, the sound a starving thing makes when it smells meat after centuries of stone sleep. He understood then that the cabin had only been the antechamber. This was the true altar, open to the sky and whatever rode between the stars. The chains on his ankles suddenly felt heavier, drawn downward by more than iron. The circle of quartz began to sing, a thin keening that scraped the inside of his skull like fingernails on slate. The garnet-haired woman stepped into the circle and the quartz stones dimmed, as though ashamed to shine in her presence. She knelt, not before Elias but before the obsidian bed, and laid both palms flat against its surface. The silver veins beneath the glass surged toward her touch like iron filings to a lodestone, forming the outline of a hand far larger than any human span. When she spoke, her voice came from everywhere and nowhere, layered with others that had never owned lungs. You were never the bait, Elias Thorne. You were the hook. She rose and turned to him. The green in her eyes had bled outward until no white remained, only a shifting forest dark lit from within by slow lightning. Your mother fled us in 71. Carried you south still quick in the womb, thought distance would break the claim. Blood remembers. Mountains remember better. Elias tried to back away and found the circle had become a wall. The standing stones pressed cold against his spine, their surfaces now slick with the same resin that filled the runes. It soaked through his skin like warm oil, rooting him in place. The chains at his ankles unclasped themselves and fell away, unnecessary now. Look, she commanded, and his gaze obeyed. The swollen moon above rippled. Its scarred face split along the carved spiral, peeling back like burnt paper. Something looked out, not with eyes, for it had never needed such frail instruments. It regarded Elias the way a man studies the keyhole before inserting the key he has carried for lifetimes. Recognition passed between them, ancient and intimate, and Elias felt every ancestor who had ever lain on this stone suddenly stand upright inside his bones. The woman walked the rim until she stood an arm's length away. She reached out and pressed 2 fingers beneath his sternum, exactly where she had drawn the first cold line hours, or centuries, earlier. Beneath her touch his skin parted without pain, a seam opening as neatly as a tailor's stitch reversed. Warm air breathed out, carrying the scent of deep earth and distant stars. You were promised before you drew breath, she said softly, almost kindly. The guest has worn many coats. Caleb was only the latest. Tonight it comes home. Inside the widening cleft something moved, not organs, not flesh as he understood it, but a slow coiling of night made solid, threads of black light weaving themselves into the spaces between his ribs. The pain was exquisite, the pleasure worse. He felt himself becoming spacious, a cathedral erected in heartbeats for a congregation of one. Above, The moon folded shut with a sound like distant thunder. The woman leaned close, lips brushing the shell of his ear, and for the first time her voice was only her own. "Welcome back, beloved. The bed has been kept warm.